Good evening, brothers and friends. Welcome to episode 8 of our 2021 Virtual Masonic Education series entitled 21st Century Conversations on Freemasonry. Before we begin, I do want to offer our sincere thoughts and prayers to everyone that has been affected by Hurricane Ida down in New Orleans and surrounding areas. And also our thoughts and prayers to those who are serving in the military, either with family or friends who are directly or indirectly involved in the unfortunate situation going on in Afghanistan. Our thoughts and prayers are with you and your families always. This 12-part series encourages a deeper thought and question regarding Freemasonry, and hopefully will bring you closer to Freemasonry, closer to your lodges, and closer to your brothers. Each meeting will deliver a specific presentation given on a Masonic topic, followed by live discussion for all who are here this evening to participate in. For those of you who are returning visitors to our education, we thank you very much for coming back. And for those of you who are new for the first time, we welcome you and thank you for being with us this evening. First, I would like to begin by recognizing the Masonic sponsors and participating brothers whom, without their support, this virtual education would not be nearly as successful or possible as it has been. First, the Rubicon Masonic Society, which is an invitation private group of Master Mason Freemasons located in Lexington, Kentucky. The purpose of the Rubicon Masonic Society is to establish a deeper understanding and connection with Freemasonry, with its traditions and practices, and also further cementing the brotherhood of its members and guests through conviviality, unity, and education outside of the lodge. Secondly, Ware Lodge of Research is dedicated to helping brothers pursue further light in Masonry. It was chartered in 1965. It is Kentucky's oldest research lodge. The lodge was named after the Most Worshipful Brother, William O. Ware, who served as the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Kentucky in his 1957-58 term. And finally, Lexington Lodge No. 1 was chartered in 1788. It is the oldest Masonic lodge in Kentucky. The lodge has historic membership, including senators, congressmen, governors, and mayors. Lexington Lodge No. 1 strives to create and deliver a heritage observance culture of Freemasonry that is reminiscent of the past. Alongside my co-hosts and dear friends this evening, Worshipful Brother Dan Kimball, past master of William O. Ware Lodge of Research and recorder of Rubicon, Worshipful Brother Tom Nitschke, current master of William O. Ware Lodge of Research and member of Rubicon, Worshipful Brother John Bizak, past master of Lexington Lodge No. 1 and vice chairman of Rubicon. My name is Brian Evans. I'm the past and current master of Lexington Lodge No. 1 and chairman of Rubicon. And again, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Let us begin. Worshipful Brother Tom Nitschke, will you please do the honors of delivering the opening devotion for our guests?
Brethren, if you would. Most holy and glorious Lord God, the great architect of the universe, the giver of all good gifts and graces, thou hast promised that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in thy name, thou wilt be in the midst of them and bless them. In thy name we assemble, most humbly beseeching thee to bless us in all our undertakings, that we may know and serve thee aright, and that all our actions may tend to thy glory and to our advancement in knowledge and virtue. And we beseech thee, O Lord God, to bless our present assembling and to illuminate our minds, that we may walk in the light of the continence, and when the trials of this probationary state are over, be admitted into the temple not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Amen.
So mote it be. Thank you, Brother Tom. The purpose of these virtual Masonic education series are to assist in the improvement of oneself by establishing a deeper understanding of our craft, of its traditions and practices, and further cementing the brotherhood of the fraternity for the betterment of mankind. Any opinions expressed during this virtual education will be those of the presenter or the participant and do not necessarily reflect the views of any lodge or Grand Lodge or the Rubicon Masonic Society. By participating with us this evening, you do consent to our guidelines and our full disclaimer, which can be viewed at rubiconmasonicsociety.com/disclaimer. A quick bit of protocol is, first of all, these are not tiled meetings, as everyone knows. Masons and non-Masons are welcome to attend and are encouraged to participate. So please be mindful that anything discussed this evening should be suitable for Masons of all degrees as well as non-Masons. Gentlemanly manners are to be expected at all times. No alcohol, smoking, food, or foul language will be permitted. There is also no discussion of politics or religion at any times. Attendees will be removed if not following protocol. In an effort to best assure that this virtual meeting is enjoyable for everyone as possible, we do have the following recommendations for you. First, recommended attire for each meeting is coat and tie. Please type your name and any appropriate Masonic title that you wish or your location under your video to identify yourself to others participating this evening. If you are not a Mason, please type guest after your name. Please also enable your video camera so other attendees can see you. Please reduce any background noise and keep your microphone muted when not speaking. Please turn off all other computer programs and try to eliminate outside distractions in your environment. And finally, please be patient should any technical difficulties occur. Brothers and friends, we are honored this evening to have the presenter that we are about to introduce, Most Worshipful Brother Robert G. Davis. Most Worshipful Brother Davis is current Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma and a fellow author. We encourage you to check out his works. Worshipful Brother Bizak, will you please do the honors of properly introducing our guest this evening?
My pleasure, brother. Thank you. Good evening, brothers. Most Worshipful Robert G. Davis has been referred to as one of the most thoughtful and perceptive Masons alive today. His Masonic resume speaks volumes about his experience and his long and productive involvement with the fraternity. He is Secretary Emeritus of the Guthrie Scottish Rite bodies, having served the Scottish Rite as Executive Secretary for 30 years. He's past master of 3 Masonic lodges in Oklahoma, 33rd degree Mason and recipient of the Grand Cross. He's also past Grand High Priest of Royal Arch Masons, past Grand Commander of the Knights Templar of Oklahoma, and serves as Oklahoma Masonic Rosicrucians as its Chief Adept. He's past Sovereign Grand Master of the Allied Masonic degrees in the United States, and as you just heard and know, he's currently the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma. Throughout his career, he's written and spoken on a long list of topics that include Masonic history, symbolism, philosophy, ritual, contemplative Masonry, fraternalism, lodge leadership and vision, membership, recruitment and retention, recognition, regularity, and attendant bodies. I quote him from his message to the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma in December of 2020. Our task and the beauty of our art is to form a society of good men who uphold the redeeming ideals of humanity so as to make good things better by our very presence. Let us with every breath of our being be about the business of being good men and our great and unique brotherhood of men. In his book, The Mason's Words, Brother Davis confesses that his interest in Freemasonry is one passion that he's not been able to subdue. And Masons today are and will be tomorrow grateful for the contributions he's made to our fraternity. Most Worshipful Grand Master, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Brother John, and all of the brothers that have zoomed in tonight. I'm glad the weather has not caused problems for you. I assumed it was kind of moving in your direction after it left the Gulf, and but it's plenty warm here in Oklahoma, and I'm delighted to be here. I particularly want to say hi to Right Worshipful Tom Jackson. I haven't seen Tom in quite a while, but Tom and I's friendship goes back at least 40 years, I think, and always considered Tom one of my mentors in the fraternity. It's kind of difficult to talk about a book that you've published because, as you know, every book is so detailed in its content that it's very, very difficult to sort of take one through it without getting too bogged down in all the minutiae that's involved with a publication like this. I will say that I was inspired. I wasn't originally inspired to write a book. I I started this project just because I had a real passion for developing an understanding about all aspects of the fraternity. I was raised in my father's lodge in a little town in northwest Oklahoma. It wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from where we lived. And I was raised on a farm and ranch in that area of the state. And my father was a very, very active Freemason. And my uncle, his brother, they had adjoining farms, and he lived about a mile and a half down the road from where we lived. And as long as I can remember, they would come in on Wednesdays. They would take a bath. They'd put on their Sunday suit. They'd slap on Old Spice deodorant, and my uncle would come by and pick up my dad, and they would go to lodge, and they did that for 50 years. And so I don't remember a time when I was not going to be a Freemason. Not only was he very active in teaching the ritual to the lodges in our particular area of the state, he and my mother were both tied to the fraternity. She was very active in the Eastern Star, and they both belonged to the Oddfellows and Rebeccas. So I can tell you that I was raised in fraternal halls, and I don't remember a time when I was not comfortable being around these wonderful old fraternal places. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is the community that was closest to where we lived was a town of about 2,500 population. And over the time of my youth, I got acquainted with all of the men in that little town. It's where we had our social conversations outside the home. And all of my life, I would run into these men. I got acquainted with the men that were the most respected men in that little town, and they paid attention to me when I'd see them on the streets. They'd come up and shake my hand. They would start a conversation with me and ask me how I was doing. Would always have something to say about my dad, and so I don't remember a time when I did not know those men. And when I showed up in the summer of 1969 to receive my first degree, all those men were there. They were my father's friends, and they were the men that I wanted to grow up to be like. And I never will forget standing in the preparation room, waiting for someone to return the knock on my door, consciously thinking to myself, tonight I'm going to be initiated into manhood. There was no question in my mind from the very beginning that Freemasonry was all about the journey to manhood. And it was established around the format that lodges should be multi-generational lodges, and each generation has a role to play in the journey to mature masculinity. And so I embraced what the teachings of Freemasonry were about from the very beginning. The other unusual thing that happened to me was about the only Masonic book that my father had in his library was Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. And I remember asking him when I was in the 6th or 7th grade if I could read that book, and he said, "Sure, son." He said, "You won't understand any of it, but you're welcome to read it." And so I launched through that book when I was in the 7th grade, and he was right. I did not understand 80% of what Albert Pike was writing, but that book had a tremendous influence on me because I picked up from his writings that what it looked like to be a moral and ethical man. And it became very, very clear to me that the degrees of Freemasonry always maintained this focus, this idea that there are ideals of masculinity that we should pay attention to, and we should try to live our life according to the highest ideals that have proven to be effective and successful for men in every generation. And I was delighted to get a mentor to help me on my journey in the beginning. But like so many other small lodges and places, my mentor knew the language of the fraternity, but I couldn't find anybody else in the lodge that knew very much about Freemasonry outside of the language itself. And when I would make an inquiry about it, they would say that what they really enjoy doing is enjoying the fellowship of getting together as men on a regular basis, performing the rituals of the fraternity, conferring the degrees, getting acquainted with new men, and just enjoying the private association that we have together as men in this unique culture of men known as the Masonic Lodge. And so I decided that I would make my own study of Freemasonry. And all of this happened back in the days before the internet, where you couldn't just Google anything that you wanted to know. You had to actually go find the information. So like some other men, I think my first passion outside of learning the ritual was to learn about the history of Freemasonry. And so I was able to find Mackey's Encyclopedia and I was able to take myself through where we came from and how long we'd been in existence and that sort of thing. And then I decided that I wanted to know who wrote the words of the ritual. And that was a much more difficult quest. And so I started talking to Masonic scholars that I had met, and they referred me to the Masonic Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And so I actually went to Cedar Rapids myself, and I spent 2 weeks on 2 separate occasions just reading everything I could get my hands on in that library. And I can tell you, if you've never been to the Cedar Rapids Library in Iowa, that's a real treat. It's a 4-story building. It's just one of the most just remarkable libraries that I've ever come across. Certainly equals the library in Massachusetts and perhaps the library in Pennsylvania. And so anyway, as I would read about the history of the ritual, I would just simply take notes, and everything that I thought was important, I just simply wrote down, and that developed as a series of essays on various aspects of this journey of the Masonic ritual, and that became a number of essays. And I noticed one day that this project would organize itself into a book quite nicely. Then I started thinking about organizing these thoughts into chapters and timelines, and around the timelines of Masonic ritual, and so I actually basically finished this book in the probably 20 years ago. And I was afraid to do anything with it because how can you write about the history of the Masonic ritual without exposing the ritual, which, as you know, in most grand jurisdictions would be considered a Masonic offense. And so that put me in a real ethical dilemma. And so I talked to Tom Jackson, I talked to Brent Morris, I talked to Art DeHoyos, I talked to Rex Hudgens, the greatest minds that I knew in the fraternity. And every one of them said, Bob, it's not a violation of your Masonic obligation if you cite an exposure that has already been published by somebody else. And while that encouraged me a great deal, I was still conflicted about that. And so even with that advice, I was afraid to publish it. And then a remarkable thing happened. The internet came into play. And Grand Lodges discovered that all of the rituals of Freemasonry had already been exposed, not just once or twice, but any number of times. And so the whole attitude of Grand Lodges changed, that it wasn't the secret work it wasn't the rituals of the fraternity that represented the real secrets of the fraternity. The ritual of the fraternity is what reveals to us the secrets, but the secrets cannot be revealed except through contemplation and intuition. They come to you and they are revealed to you as you're simply sitting in lodge time and time again, and you hear something differently than you've ever heard it before, and you have kind of a voila moment, and you discover something that was hidden there that you had not previously discovered. And once you have one of those insightful moments, they start occurring more frequently. And that, of course, launched me into a real study of the symbolism and the allegories of the fraternity. And I kind of got wrapped up in trying to interpret the meaning of the rituals. So I finally decided to publish the book with the assurance from my own Grand Lodge that, Brother Davis, you're not going to get in trouble for simply citing words that, have been cited by other Masonic authors or non-Masons who are exposing rituals in the past. And so with that degree of confidence, I decided to publish the book. And so the book is really designed to be about the history and evolution of the American Masonic ritual. And so it's focused entirely on from whence our ritual workings came, beginning with the guild ceremonies of the 15th centuries, and moving forward through Scotland and how that work came together in Scotland and England, and then how that work developed from the Union of 1813 and made its way to the American colonies. And so what I was focused on was tracing the ritual language from the early speculative era through its development through the English ritualist, and then how it was brought across to the colonies, and then how the ritual workings worked their way westward from the eastern seaboard throughout America. So I only paid attention to those individuals that had a significant role to play in the ritual that we use in America today. And while there were other ritualists in England and France that made significant contributions to what the ritual would end up looking like in continental Europe, I did not bother to follow that lineage because that lineage is not really, even though they influenced some of the things that came to the ritual workings we have today, their actual practices of ritual, such as the emulation workings, you don't find very often in the United States. I know England, I know Canada, brought over the English emulation workings, and they practice that working up there. So they know more about the influence those that developed that kind of ritual than I do. So in looking at, in kind of looking at a very, very general review of our ritual history, we know that that our origins, if they did not come from the operative guilds of Scotland, they were certainly inspired by the guilds. We may never know for sure how much influence associated organizations may have had in some of our ritual workings, but I think most Masonic scholars today believe that we transitioned from the governing structure of the guilds. And the operative guilds were actually made up of three different kinds of organization. There were the trade guilds, and there were the merchant guilds, and there were the religious guilds. And our beginning started with the trade guilds. And the trade guilds were municipal corporations, and they functioned very much like trade unions would function today. They had rules and regulations that governed the employment of the guild members, that governed the behavior of the guild members, that governed the proficiency ceremonies that one went through to prove that he was prepared to advance in any particular trade that he followed. And so that was kind of the basis of the structure of Freemasonry that we inherited from the guilds. And that pretty much got organized in 1598 and 1599, when William Shaw, the master of the works for the crown, established the statutes under which the guilds would operate. And in 1598, he developed the titles of the guilds, the men who led the guilds, and those became the titles that we adopted in speculative masonry. And then 1599, he wrote a second set of statutes that created the overall government of the guilds. And that particular form of government is the government that we established when we became a speculative society of Freemasons. And these guilds, of course, they were known for their skills in the various building trades, because their function was to erect the municipal buildings and the palaces and the cathedrals and that kind of thing in Europe. But just because they were tradesmen, that did not mean that they did not have a continuing and regular association with the architects, the geometricians, and the intellectual minds that were involved in laying out the plans for the construction that took place. So it was inevitable that those intellectual men would be inspired to become a part of the guilds. And so the guildsmen started bringing non-operative Masons into their society. We don't know exactly when that started, but we know that that speculative Masons were coming into the operative lodges, even though they weren't called lodges at that time, as early as 1632. And we all know some of the names: Robert Moray, Elias Ashmole, some of the men that were speculative Masons that joined those guilds. And we also know that the making ceremonies, the ceremonies that were used to bring people into the Society of Masons, we sort of know what those looked like because they were fragments of those making ceremonies have been found beginning in 1696 with the Edinburgh House manuscript and working all the way up through 1730. And there were a total of 16 ritual exposés over this period of time, and taken together, they pretty well give us a complete picture of what the joining ceremonies looked like in this transition period from operative to speculative masonry. We know that something called the Mason word, was given to us in the Edinburgh Register House manuscript of 1696. But we also know that much earlier, ceremonial fragments appear that talk about the Mason's word, 100 years before 1696. We don't know what the word was, and we don't know what the significance of the word was, but we know that Masons were playing around with this concept of a word, and this word became central to the evolution of the language of the fraternity. And each of these ritual manuscripts, beginning with the Edinburgh House Register manuscript of 1696, the Chetwood Crawley manuscript of 1700, the Sloan manuscript of 1700, and the Hawfoot fragment of 1702, we know those four manuscripts together gave us the foundation upon which all Masonic ritual evolved. And so we know that men were simply made Masons. They were made apprentice Masons, and they were made fellows. And yet there was no degree system. There was no degree system actually in place, prior to the 18th century. We know the ceremonies were short. We know that they generally took place in association with a feast, a dining experience, and they generally were a simple matter of the men learning the oath and being given the traditional history and learning about the old charges of the operative guilds. And they were not much greater than that. And so the moral lessons that took place only through conversations that were held at a table between the men of the lodge and the new candidates. And these were always done in a question and answer format. And of course, those became known as the catechisms or the categorical lectures. And so the one thing that we can say is that the catechisms, or this idea of learning through questions and answers, it was the earliest form of teaching in our fraternity. And so while over the last 300 years, we may have shortened the catechisms, in some cases we may have eliminated them altogether, we want to make sure that we never lose them. And it's important to retain them pretty much in their original form for study, because they are the oldest tradition that we have in the development of our own ritual language. When the Grand Lodge of England was organized in 1717, there was still basically an entered apprentice ceremony, perhaps a degree, and there might have been a portion of a second degree that we ultimately, named the fellowcraft degree. But the Master Mason degree, or the third degree of Masonry, does not exist in the structure of speculative Freemasonry and did not come about until at least 8 years after the 4 London lodges organized the Grand Lodge of 1717. And there's much speculation as to why the third degree entered the system. And the reason for that is that it was an entirely different ritual and different ceremony than anything else that had been developed at any time in the development of the language of the fraternity. And it comes from an entirely different tradition. The Master Mason degree came out of the mystery play tradition. And the mystery plays were a long-standing tradition in the trades and in the churches and even in the merchant guilds. The plays were called morality plays. If they related to the guilds, they were called miracle plays. If they had to do with the saints and the martyrs, they were called interludes. If they had to do with the church, and they just kind of combined the various forms of these plays into the mystery play tradition. And these plays were ceremonies that were very, very popular through the whole era of operative masonry. And they were largely formed by the guilds that took various aspects of the play tradition and developed those themselves. And they were performed for the church. And they became so popular, they got too big for the church, so they moved them out to the streets. And of course, the trade guilds were very, very important elements of these plays. And so one assumption was that the Master Mason degree must have originated from one of these mystery plays that had been developed at some time by the trades who were performing them for the church. And the problem is that out of the 130 extant plays that we know about, there's not a one of them that discusses anything known as the Hieroglyphic legend. And so it's we can't really say for certain that the Hiram legend that we know today came from that tradition, but we know that it is a mystery play in its form. Now, there's another thing that may have led to the development of the Master Mason degree, and that was the Graham manuscript that was discovered in 1726. And it was referred to, Noachitic, it was referred to as Noachitic Masonry. And it was alluded to in the constitutions of 1723. And the Graham manuscript tells a story about Noah and his 3 sons. And the storyline of that play parallels the drama section of the Master Mason degree so closely that it appears to be much more than coincidence that may have been the source that the Hiramic legend came from. Because an interesting thing happened between the constitutions of 1723 and 1726. And that was that there was a tremendous growing interest in King Solomon and King Solomon's temple. Everybody became very, very fascinated with this thing called the Solomonic tradition. And everybody was studying it. All of the intellectual societies were studying the tradition of Solomon and the building of Solomon's temple. The King of England even had Solomon's temple, a 7-foot model of Solomon's temple built so he could study it himself. And so the Masons saw that there might be a strategic advantage in developing our tradition around the building of Solomon's temple than keeping with a tradition that might have started with the patriarch Noah. And in any event, so much activity was being centered around this idea of Solomon's temple that it is believed that perhaps the Hiramic legend was developed by those people in the Grand Lodge of England, and it was developed purposefully to move from the old Noah patriarch to the patriarch of Solomon, and then follow his lineage through the building and the destruction and the rebuilding and the destruction and rebuilding of these temples. What a wonderful theme that would create for the storyline in all the degrees of Freemasonry. There is at least one bit of evidence that that George Payne, who was the second Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, who was an antiquarian, he was a historian, he was a serious student in religion, and he and Desaguliers, John Desaguliers, who was a member of the Royal Society and also an antiquarian himself, and James Anderson, a Scotsman who also had a similar background with these other two men. And there is a theory out there that these three gentlemen may have been the individuals that created the third degree of Freemasonry, and that in fact it was a Grand Lodge era innovation rather than an innovation that came from a prior time, even though it may well have been influenced by Rosicrucian thinking, by the alchemist, by the Kabbalist, because these men were studying all of these esoteric traditions at the same time. The reason that there's a tie to Desaguliers is that there is a set of minutes that was revealed where this brother was complaining that the penman Desaguliers turned this fellow named Hiram Abiff into a much, much greater historical figure than the biblical references would give us. And he was kind of making fun at Desaguliers for turning this Hiram Abiff into someone who was an expert in all kinds of aspects of building and architecture. And just because he called Desaguliers the penman of the legend leads us to believe that this could well have been a Grand Lodge era invention. We know that a Master Mason degree was conferred on a fellow named Charles Cotton by a society of musicians and architects who just happened to also be Freemasons. And we know that this Charles Cotton was was raised a Master Mason because in the minutes of their society meeting, it said that having been initiated an apprentice and passed as a fellow craft, he was raised to the degree of Master Mason on that evening, 1724, 1725. And it caused some real problems in the Grand Lodge to the point that the Grand Master contacted this society of musicians and architects and told them to cease and desist, that they were not authorized to be conferring these degrees. Well, this society never paid any attention to the Grand Master, and the Grand Master just made his declaration and nothing more came of it. Except that Samuel Pritchard comes along in 1730 with his famous exposure, Masonry Dissected. And Samuel Pritchard exposes the entire ritual of this Master Mason degree, this third degree of the fraternity. And apparently his exposure was so popular that his expose became an aid to the memory work among the Masons in the lodges at that time. And there was a number of different editions of Masonry Dissected, something like 8 editions that were published in the next 10 years or so. But since none of the exposés prior to 1730 included the Hiramic legend, and it first appears in Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, and it's first confirmed in 1724, 1725, it gives us every reason to believe that the third degree came into the system in that 5-year period of time between 1725 and 1730. Now, even though it existed and some lodges chose to confer it, it was not actually adopted as a required degree by the Grand Lodge of England until the constitutions of 1738. It was considered an optional degree. And the Grand Lodge was quite content to put fellow crafts or fellows of the craft into political positions of the Grand Lodge, even to the point that in 1751, the man who served as the Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ancients was a fellow craft Mason. And so this evolution of the third degree didn't really catch on in England until this period from 1738 and moving forward from that. But at the same time, there were other things going on. And one of them was the Samuel Pritchard was so accurate in its exposure of the Masonic rituals that were taking place at that time that the Grand Lodge of England reacted very strongly towards that, to the extent that it is said that they reversed the passwords of the degrees and that kind of thing. They made some changes to the basic ritual structure, and that then created a schism between the lodges in England, particularly among the Irish Masons that were living in England, and that and this other problem with innovation known as the Royal Arch degree surfaces in the 1740s, and so this leads ultimately to the development of a second Grand Lodge of England, known as the Grand Lodge of Ancients, and established in 1751. And so we still have, up until the 1770s, we still have pretty much the original ritual form that came out of these exposures from 1696 to 1730. Then from 1730 to 1769, 20 more ritual exposés were published, beginning in 1730 with Masonry Dissected, The Mystery of Freemasonry, and these exposures then started coming out of France. There was a lodge in France that was chartered by the Grand Lodge of England, and it became a real source of ritual development on the continent. And so while English exposures were few and far between in this period from 1730 to 1760, there were a number of French exposures that came into popularity and use, and these French exposures were helpful in establishing the traditions that we know today, and primarily those traditions that have to do with festiboards. It was the French that actually created an organized way to enjoy the conviviality of Freemasonry in assemblies of Masons through ritual forms that they created just for the feast at the table. And so the festiboard tradition that we know today, and which I'm sure you all have experienced, and everything from table lodges to festiboard routines with the firing glasses and all that sort of stuff, and all that we received from the French. Not much happened that we know of new in English Freemasonry up until about 1760. And then from 1760 to 1769, another series of rituals come into being, and these are primarily English ritual exposures. And they're much, much more complete. The explanations of almost all of the aspects of the first section lectures that we encounter, the explanations of everything that we pretty much know about the middle chamber lectures of the fellowcraft degree, all of these things were developed in this period from the 1740s up to the 1760s. And two of these that became very, very popular was a publication called Three Distinct Knocks in 1780, 60, and an exposure known as Jacob and Boaz that came out in 1762. And these really were the beginnings of the establishment of lectures associated with the initiation, passing, and raising ceremonies. And this kind of brought about the development of men who were accustomed to delivering lectures over the moral teachings, the ethical teachings, all the symbols represented in the rituals of Freemasonry. And they did this largely in places like the Lodge of Antiquity, in other research lodges, and in just gatherings that they sponsored themselves. And from that group of men who brought the philosophy of Freemasonry into the ritual, three of them stand out. William Hutchinson, Calcott, and William Preston. And these three men published lengthy essays on their writings. Hutchinson's comes out in 1774 with illustrations of Freemasonry, he displays this before the Grand Lodge, and it was very, very well received. Ellens Calcott publishes a series of lectures in his Disquisition on Freemasonry in 1769. And then William Preston, of course, follows that with his illustrations of Freemasonry in 1772. And all of these men were very impressive. And they were all popular. They were well known. They were so good at giving these lectures and presenting essays on the moral and ethical and philosophical dimensions of Freemasonry through the use of its symbol system and its allegorical form, that everybody wanted to copy them, and so they took them as they were written, and they just became adopted into the system. And so the second half of the 18th century became known as the era of the English ritualists, English lectures. And I would say that these men, what the work that they did in the last half of the 18th century, combined with the ritual ceremonies that had been fully developed by 1730 up through the 1740s, with additions that came to the work from our French brothers, that created the ritual in its entirety that we know today and that we inherited as American Freemasons. And the other person then that becomes important to us is Thomas Smith Webb. And you all know the story of Thomas Smith Webb. He's kind of known as the father of Freemasonry in America. He publishes his Rituals of 1779. And that book, of course, is published. I don't know how many editions, at least 8 editions came out from his original publication in 1797. And but he did another thing that became very, very important. He was a bookbinder by trade, became a bookseller by trade, and he lived in Boston for a while. He moved to Keens, New Hampshire for a while, and he ended up in Albany, New York. And he became the center of ritual development on the Eastern Seaboard, with an entirely different concern that the English ritualist had. And his concern was, since the Masons migrated from Europe, from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and France, and these various places, they already knew ritual when they came to the colonies, and everybody was working a different form of ritual. And Webb's concern was that American Freemasonry could not survive if the ritual was not standardized. We were too young in a country, and we were too diversified ourselves in the country to survive in a system where every Grand Lodge had a different ritual working. And so he's the man who believed that the rituals had to be standardized, and it was critical to our survival. And so he learns supposedly the ritual workings that was brought over here from the William Preston workings, although it is not known that Thomas Smith Webb ever visited England, and there's absolutely no record that he ever had any association with William Preston. But what happened was that Webb got acquainted with a guy named John Hamner, and John Hamner owned a hotel that Webb lived in for a while. And they started attending lodge together, and Hanmer supposedly received the lectures, the ritual from Preston himself, because he came from England. Hamner and a guy named Ed Ames and Thomas Smith Webb, the three of them got together and they developed this ritual working that Webb would adopt. And Webb decided that the only way we're going to standardize the ritual in America is that we've got to teach the ritual to men, and those men have to then instruct lodges all over the Eastern Seaboard in this ritual working, and that's exactly what he did. And he developed 5 principal students, and you know a couple of them. And I've got the list of those guys here because I never. His students became Jeremy Cross, John Barney, Benjamin Gleason, John Snow, and Henry Fow. He deputized those men to learn the ritual workings that he learned from Hamner, which supposedly came from Preston and Calcott and Hutchinson's working, and he sent them out as roving ritualists to teach lodges everywhere this standardized work. And Kentucky is one of those grand lodges that received the benefit of 2 of those men. John Snow taught a number of lodges the work in Kentucky, and Jeremy Cross was also very active in Kentucky. So some of the ritual language that you experience in Kentucky today, I know came to you from the direct students of Thomas Webb, because Kentucky was one of the grand jurisdictions that they worked in. Now, of course, Webb is also involved in creating, the Yorkite workings of Freemasonry. He was very much involved with the establishment of the Grand Encampment and, General Grand Councils. And so his 1797 publication also includes a number of the Yorkite workings. But his job was to create rituals and standardize those rituals in all of the bodies of Freemasonry. And that's what he did. And now that leads us, of course, to another major element of the book, and that had to do with the 3 national efforts to standardize Masonic ritual. Yeah, and the first of those, of course, occurred at and around the Union of 1813, when we had the ritual workings of the Ancients Grand Lodge, lodges under the Ancients Grand Lodge. We had the ritual workings of the lodges under what became known as the modern Grand Lodge, or the Premier Grand Lodge. And they had the difficult job of trying to combine and standardize the ritual workings of the lodges of those 2 grand jurisdictions. And they did this by forming a lodge of promulgation in 1809. And they gave these brothers the task of combining all the ritual workings that they had available to them into one standard form. And that standard form then was to be presented at the meeting of 1813, when the union of the 2 grand lodges occurred. Now, a couple things happened at that union of 1813 that are significant. One thing that happened was that the Union of 1813 de-Christianized the rituals of Freemasonry. Before 1813, there were a lot more blatant Christian references to the ritual than what evolved after the Union of 1813. And that was largely the result of one of the dukes who had a really good friend who was was a Jewish fellow. And through the influence that this Jewish fellow had on him, he insisted that the rituals become more inclusive, so that they could bear the different fate systems that men were experiencing. And so that happened. The other thing that happened was that after the Union of 1813 group agreed on the adoption of the ritual, they organized a lodge of reconciliation to go out and teach the new standardized ritual to all the lodges. And that process went on from 1813 to 1816. And you know what the result of that process was? All of the men in the old lodges had already learned the ritual that they were practicing. They weren't about to take on a new ritual, and so it didn't work. And therefore England was unable to stabilize the ritual workings themselves. But a couple of things came out of that: the Lodge of the Stewards, the emulation ritual, and so a number of ritual workings came out of that have ended up being adopted by lodges in the Grand Lodge of England. And also the other good thing that came out of that is England decided early on that there's much to be said for a diversified ritual working. And they have always promoted the idea that lodges can adopt and use any ritual that they want to use, as long as it's a ritual that's sanctioned by the Grand Lodge. And so, as you know, there's many ritual workings in the lodges of England today. So, with Webb and his students in America still resolved to standardize the ritual, they decided to, in 1843, they created in 1842, they invited all the Grand Lodges to come, and I think it was I don't know if they met in Baltimore. Do you remember, Tom, if they met in Baltimore in 1842? And their whole purpose of the Baltimore Convention was to try to convince all the lodges that were represented there to agree on a standard form of ritual and take it back and adopt it in their jurisdictions. The problem was that they did not get enough Grand Lodges to participate in the Convention of 42 to make that work. And so they called another convention in 1843. And I think in that convention, they had over 20 of the 36 Grand Lodges represented. They certainly had a quorum of Grand Lodges there, so they tried once again. And they met for a period of a week. They developed a committee to put together the standardized work. It was presented for them. Everybody left supposedly reasonably happy. They left it up to 3 men to put that work together in final form. And with a committee made up of John Dove and a couple of other fellows. And the problem is that when the committee went to work, they left out some of the aspects of the ritual workings from the Baltimore Convention that John Dove felt like were essential. And they did not consult him in leaving those aspects of the working ritual out of their final copy of the workings. And he got very, very upset. And he sent a missive out to all the Grand Lodges in the United States, and saying that the committee got together to put a standard form together, and the other 2 committee men did not follow the job that they were given them. And so I'm telling you that this work that came out of the Baltimore Convention is not the work that was adopted by the convention, and you shouldn't have anything to do with it. So there you go. The Baltimore Convention ends up as a failure, although Virginia publishes the Rituals of the Baltimore Convention, as do a number of other jurisdictions. And so some workings that came out of the Baltimore Convention we certainly have in our ritual workings today. And one other effort was Robert Morris's conservators movement in 1860. And he made another effort to standardize the working ritual by creating an organization of men known as the conservatists. And they would meet secrecy, and they would learn the ritual, and then they were charged to go back and deliver those ritual teachings and get them adopted in their Grand Lodge. And Robert claimed that he was a student of Webb. And I don't know if he claimed he was a direct student of Webb, but he claimed that he had the original Webb workings. And Webb didn't even live in Morris's lifetime. And it became a matter of much contention among these men who were trying to develop a standardized ritual, that Rob Morris really wasn't teaching the original Webb work, because he didn't know the original Webb work. And so he tried that. He tried to get his conservators movement on board. He worked on that for 5 years. He never could develop any traction. And so the final effort to standardize the ritual workings in the United States died with the conservative movement of the 1860s. And by that time, of course, through the roving ritualists that were teaching Masonry in lodges all over the place, and the development of grand lecture or grand custodian of the works, or whatever you give it, within each of the grand lodges themselves, the grand lodges ultimately decided that they would adopt the ritual working that they wanted to adopt, and it would be their sovereign right to do that. And that's exactly what happened. The grand lodges took on the business of the ritual working that exists in every state, and that is, of course, that is how we practice Freemasonry today in America. So that is kind of a general overview of the various dimensions of our ritual evolution that I wrote about in considerable detail in the book. And I might add that I also cited specific ritual workings in various sections of the degrees that were thought to have been penned by one of these individuals, that we can attribute it to them. And I kind of tried to give you an idea of who the principal authors were of each of the elements of the ritual that we now practice today. So that's what that book is all about. And I'm excited to say that it was just named by the Southern California Research Lodge as one of the top 10 Masonic books of the millennium. So that's a very, very nice honor to receive from that respected research lodge. And I think with that, I'll stop, if that's okay with you, brothers, and we can just start having a discussion now.
Most Worshipful Davis, thank you very much. Excellent recap of the book and the history. Brothers and friends, anyone that has any questions, you're welcome to raise your virtual hand here in the system, and I can click on you and call on you. You're also welcome to input your question in the chat box as well. We'll take all the virtual live questions first. I would like to just start, Most Worshipful Davis, and just ask you, what do you think Freemasonry would have been like if the results of the Baltimore Convention were different and the ritual was standardized? What would your prediction have been?
Well, I think in the overall picture, it it would be a mistake. Strategically, I don't believe that we should be so narrow-minded that we insist that there's just one version of the work that men should learn. And I think if we look at the Grand Lodge system in Europe, ritual diversity is a part of almost every one of those Grand Lodges. And as you know, almost all lodges in Europe are founded around the idea of affinity lodges. All lodges are small in number, and some Grand Lodges even have regulations that you cannot have over 50 members or 100 members. And the idea is that Freemasonry works best when as Freemasons we have things in common outside of Freemasonry itself. Our social conversations cannot be only tied to what we learn inside the tiled recesses. They have to be tied to the things that we have in common as men. And it's those social contacts that we have and connection we have that bond us just as much as the ritual workings bond us. Mm-hmm. And a diversity in ritual also enables, I think, an added interest in the fraternity. I know myself, having traveled around the country, and some of you guys have done the same. And my gosh, Tom Jackson probably seen more rituals than anybody in the world. And we enjoy going to other jurisdictions and hearing how the ritual varies from the ritual in our own state. And in every case, we know we're in a Masonic lodge, and we know that we're hearing about Masonry, but just the way things that are presented enables us to develop insights that we would never develop if we didn't have those opportunities. And I think that's why diversity in ritual might be important in our own time.
Well said. Yeah, well said. I think that's an excellent response. I appreciate that. We do have some other questions.
Sure.
Brother Gerald, I'm gonna get to you right after Brother Piercy. Brother Piercy, go ahead.
Thank you. A very good presentation. Thank you. It's very interesting. Freemasonry came to the colonies before there was 3 degrees. It came initially when there was still 2. But the growth of the 3rd degree in Britain seems to have universally carried over to the colonies. Was that because of Webb, do you think, or are there some isolated lodges in the U.S. that still practice 2 degrees?
I don't know of any lodges in the U.S. that practice 2 degrees. As a matter of fact, I think since every Grand Lodge has adopted the landmarks, and the landmarks tell us how many degrees we are to have. There shall be 3 degrees, including, of course, the Holy Roll Arch, and that, of course, came from the insistence of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients in the Union of 1813. That's how that ended up the landmarks. So 2 things happened. The landmarks were in place, and also the provincial Grand Lodge system of England was operating in all of the early Grand Lodges in America. The provincial Grand Masters were like our deputy Grand Masters, in a sense that they had the voice of the Grand Master of England in America. And so they literally served as the deputy to the Grand Master of England. And so the provincial Grand Lodges were very, very instrumental in bringing the roots of Masonry from the English system to the colonies. And so I think that's another reason why even though the colonies were in place, 100 and 150 years before, we became the United States. All of those early forms of rituals that were working wherever they came from Scotland, Ireland, England, or any other jurisdiction, that was working the ritual at that time. I'm not saying that the Master Mason ritual was worked in the colonies. Obviously, it would not have been worked in the colonies prior to the 1730s or later. So there probably was no more than a making ceremony, or at most a 2-degree system for the first 150 years or so. But by the time we became the United States, and as the Grand Lodges developed westward, then we all adopted the landmarks and the 3-degree system.
Are you aware that Christopher Powell has recently published a paper giving the 3rd degree almost exclusively to Desaguliers?
No, I'm not aware of that, but as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I am one of those men who believes that Desaguliers was the author of the 3rd degree, and I've asked that same question of several other noted scholars across the United States, including Arturo de Hoyos, and they also agree that that Desaguliers was probably the principal author. Now, George Payne, was involved with that. James Anderson was probably involved with that. I'm not saying that he penned it himself, but it sure does look like that he made it happen. And it follows so closely the ritual form of the Graham manuscript, which came out the same year, that it's almost too much of a coincidence that there wasn't a tie. The legends weren't tied together.
That paper is available. It's on AQC for Quatercornatum. It will be published in their volume this November, but it's already available on the AQC website if you're curious. When it's published this fall, it will have all of the debate with it, which I haven't seen. I've only seen the paper itself, but it's quite interesting. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for the feedback on that.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. Brother Jerry.
Thank you, Brother Brian. Most Worshipful Robert, it's so great to see you. I've gotten so used to seeing you at least once or twice a year, going to Guthrie, and you coming out here to visit South Pasadena Lodge and speak there, and all of our interactions with the Fraternal Review, and the issue that you were just talking about is going to be a 24-pager. And it'll come out day after tomorrow on the 1st to the digital subscribers. And you finishing where you did in the top 10, in my opinion, I was the particular the guest editor for this coming issue, was one of the 2 least surprising things in the poll. I'm sure you'll remember that your book, The Mason's Word, which is what actually finished in this poll, was our number 9 top 10 books when we took it last time in 2016, and this time we're trying to focus on the new millennium. And I was just looking when I was thinking about this lecture this afternoon, and you placed number 9 there, and if you subtract all the guys' books who were not eligible this time because they weren't in the 21st century, you moved up accordingly to how many of those got moved out of the way. And the same thing about when we had our poll 2 years later on esoteric authors. And particularly, we tried to emphasize that esoteric doesn't just mean the wisdom tradition, although that's certainly there, but the kind of work that you have done here with this book on tracing the history of our rituals. And we've had issues. If you go to the researchlodge.com and look at our back issues, we have issues on Noahide Freemasonry and the early Grand Lodge history, and a number of these kind of things. But I thought that and I actually voted your book higher than the poll did, but the poll has it really up there. I'll just to preserve a little of the mystery, it's in the top 5. And there we have reviews that are in there that were contributed by some of the brothers that are doing this. And just as a little preview, next March, the Rubicon Society will be guest editing the Fraternal Review to do an entire issue dedicated to the documentary that they've recently produced and will be released soon on the festive board tradition in Freemasonry. So, but with all of that, and I'm glad that Very Worshipful Brother Percy broke the ice by making such a blatant plug for Research Lodge. But I also have a question for you, and it's a little bit off of this, but it's right out of your book. Indeed, the last chapter of your book, and it's one of the most highlighted of many highlighted sentences in your book, on my personal copy. And it's in the first paragraph of chapter 15, the rebirth of Masonry and Masonic ritual. And it says, men no longer follow their fathers into Masonry, and they haven't for several generations. Grand Lodge policies holding to the no ask rule will most assuredly mark a death blow for the fraternity in their state or province. Could you just say a couple of words about that? Because I think it's an awfully important message to give anytime there's an audience of the caliber that we've got here listening to you tonight.
Well, I'm actually surprised that there are still Grand Lodges that say that you cannot ask someone to be a Mason. In Oklahoma, our Grand Lodge in 1985, they adopted a policy which has never been changed. And that policy says simply that it is a Masonic offense to solicit someone to become a Freemason. And they went ahead and they defined what the word solicitation means. And solicitation is a word that means to urge with obnoxious persistency. And that is illegal in our Grand Lodge. But if you ask a friend to become a Freemason, that's permitted in our Grand Lodge because you're not soliciting him at that point. Now, if you continue to, haggle him, you start twisting his arm, then you would cross that line. But there's so much available now about Freemasonry through the digital world. I mean, my gosh, there's podcasts taking place, excellent podcasts. You can sign up for a podcast almost every night of the week. There's YouTube videos, by the dozens. There's any information that you want to know about Freemasonry, right down to the exposure of our rituals, is all available to anybody. And so in my experience, we don't have to, we don't really have to ask someone to become a Mason, except those people that are within our own social network, because we have all the tools that we need to present whatever we want to present to the profane world in any form we want to present to them. And that, I don't know if you guys have followed the beafreemason.org campaign. We adapted that to be an Oklahoma Freemason campaign. And we added 3 examinations to that website. And we do Facebook ad boosts. And you know, there's a lot of Grand Lodges would say that, well, that's asking people to join, but it's tools that are out there. They're going to go to it whether you put it out there or somebody else does. And so we're much better off engaging ourselves in meaningful conversation about what Freemasonry is and what they could get out of being a Freemason than we are to just sit back and never say a word. And you know, I honestly think, Gerald, that business of not talking about Freemasonry came about at the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, America was very paranoid about communism infiltrating American institutions. And Grand Lodges jumped a hold of that, and Grand Lodges encouraged the lodges to go inside their tiled recesses and be quiet and don't say anything about Freemasonry. And I think that's what created that, you know, quiet nature that our grandfathers had. And they were taught not to say anything about it, and maybe for good reasons at the time, but we live in a different world today. They're going to find out about it with or without us. And so we're better off being a part of the conversation with them.
Brother Davis, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's interesting that I was wanting to respond to you and bring up the parallel to our common misunderstanding of the whole concept of secrecy. And they're so obviously related that you went there without my prompting. But Masonic secrecy is a topic that I the first couple of years that I was the master of the research lodge here in Southern California, I kept running all the time into things. Are you saying things that can't be said? And so the first issue of our 2018 year, which is our 3rd year of printing, Masonic secrecy was the topic, and that is, if you're having some doubts, get a copy of that fraternal review about secrecy and the very limited stuff involving the words and the signs and the tokens and those kind of things. That's what's secret, and we and the what you're doing, what we're doing, what the Rubicon Society is doing is we need to put our best foot forward. And who are the most likely people to meet the right kind of men to welcome through that west gate than the kind of men that are here participating in what we're doing right now, who've read your book, who thought your book is one of the best books that's been written on Masonry in recent years. We meet people, and I don't think I cross the line when I say it sounds like you might be interested in Masonry. And boy, the right kind of guys. take that little bite and run with it. And they're asking to be masonry. So when they're asked eventually if it's of their own free will and accord, they can very well say, yes, it was. I was hoping somebody would ask me about it sometime or another.
Mhm.
Thank you,
And
Brother
as
Jerry.
usual, Brother Brian, I've used up way more than my share of the airtime, but I'm just so turned on by this presentation. I think that it was super, and everybody ought to get a copy of this book and learn about our ritual and travel to other lodges and see other rituals performed. But thank you, Brother Davis. I look forward to seeing you again in Guthrie one day.
Thank you for the kind words, Gerald. Let me say this, don't ever forget that Freemasonry is hieroglyphic instruction illustrated by symbols and represented by allegory. So all the secrets are hidden in those three things, and they have nothing to do with any expose that you read. I don't care if you even get access to the grip signs and words. You're not going to get the secrets of Freemasonry until you reach a point where you can interpret the hieroglyphical instruction and you can understand the allegories and you can apply the symbols to both. And no
And
one can do
meditation
that.
is absolutely the key to that door.
And no one can do that until they are Freemason and they've reached a point of internal growth that those secrets are revealed to them.
Well said. Thank you, brothers. Brother Jerry, we'll let it slide again. Don't worry about it. And thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for what you do at the Southern California Lodge of Research. So thank you very much. Brothers, for the sake of time, we're going to buzz through just a few more questions. Brother Bruce, I'm going to let you go, and then I'm going to call on a couple brothers, and we will conclude for the evening. So, Brother Bruce, go ahead.
Again, excellent, Brother Davis. I've learned a lot again tonight, and I did have occasion a couple of years ago when Kentucky was celebrating its anniversary, I believe, that the Mississippi Mountain Men came up and did a degree about an hour's drive south of Cincinnati, which is where I'm from. And the thing that I was exposed to, and this is where my question comes in, is in all of your readings and everything, does it talk about how lectures are given in any of the books, things that you've read? Because what Mississippi demonstrated was during the actual lecture of the Master Mason degree, different members, and I think most of the men of the Mississippi Mountain Men degree group were past masters, and they each took a section of the lecture, and I found that to be very interesting and almost helpful, because I think sometimes a lot of our members get scared off, and I knew I have had problems learning the lecture. So is that talked about anywhere as to how it's come about?
Well, I think it is a matter of whatever rules have been established by your board of grand lectures or custodians of the work, or whatever name you give that Grand Lodge committee. In my grand jurisdiction, there's no prohibition of different men taking on different paragraphs of those lectures. And as a matter of fact, I wonder if this is not fairly common. I would estimate that 70% of the lodges in Oklahoma, the men in 70% of the lodges in Oklahoma have never seen the third section lectures. And the reason for that is we have so few members across the state that memorize them. And those guys just can't get everywhere. And so that solves that problem. If you can divide that up among 3 or 4 good ritualists and let them take it on. I personally, in our own jurisdiction, there's a very, very small amount of that language that's considered esoteric. I really don't see why Grand Lodges just don't digitize the 3rd section lectures, put the best voice on them they have, add contemporary images to the old lantern slide images, and then give the master a discussion paper with 6 or 8 questions he can ask the members of the lodge right after they've seen that 3rd section lecture. I think that'd be a hit.
Wow. Thank you. That's, yeah, it's, I think Ohio has gotten where we do it digitally. Unfortunately, we're still counting upon one individual to, and we were lucky because one of the members of our lodge who now, for a Master Mason degree, he came up, I think, from either North or South Carolina, and he's participating in the lodge down there. And I think he was junior or senior warden down there, but he has a photographic memory. And so doing the charges was very easy for him. Doing the lectures has been very easy for the most part for him. But everybody's not like that. And
I know.
I don't know how old you are, but I'm 67. I'm about to turn 68 in a little over a month. And it's hard at this age. So,
Yeah.
So
Well,
thank you very much.
My rule as just being a Grand Master, of course, the Grand Master only rules for a year and doesn't count, after he's out of office. But, anything that is written in your monitor is public. Your wife can read it. If it's public, then it can be delivered any way you want to deliver it. It's not secret work. It's not esoteric work. So if you're one of those few Grand Lodges that don't have any esoteric work in your 3rd section lectures, gosh, I'd certainly begin some conversation, see if you could get approval to allow just what you're saying to happen.
Thank you,
There's
brother.
there's so much meat in those 3rd section lectures. And for them, I've met Master Masons that have been Master Masons for 10 years who've never heard those lectures. It's just unbelievable.
Brother Kimball, do you have a question for Most Worshipful this evening?
I do. Thank you, Worshipful Brother Brian. Most Worshipful Brother Davis, thank you for your presentation. I read and enjoyed the Mason's words, and hearing you amplify it tonight has certainly been very enjoyable. Just based on all of the ritual that you've studied and to which you've been exposed over the years, is there a portion of the ritual that is most meaningful to you?
Oh boy. Well, that's a hard one for me. I just wrote another book. Here I am promoting another book, but I just wrote a book called In Search of Light, and it's only available on my website. And what it is an interpretation of the allegories, hieroglyphs, and symbols of Freemasonry. And I'm not going to put it on Amazon because I consider it a work only for Masons. And having gone through that, I just don't think that you can leave any part out of it. There's only one degree where a man is initiated into Freemasonry, and that's the entered apprentice degree. It's the only initiation ritual that exists in the whole of Freemasonry. And that represents his formal rite of passage to manhood. And so how could I say that there's not anything in the entered apprentice degree that's not important? And the fellowcraft degree is so symbolic and allegorical that, it's profound, the teachings of that degree. And then the Hiram Legic, the legend of the tragic hero, is an allegory in and of itself, and it means something entirely different than what you see as you watch that performance. And so I can't say there's one thing I like better than another. Yep, I just can't, because every bit of it, every bit of it, I don't know how to say this, resonates in my mind in a different way. And I think about it, almost every aspect of it, from a different point of view. And so you might want to think about looking at that In Search of Light. It explains a whole lot of things that aren't explained in the ritual.
And for those listening in, it's robertgdavis.net.
Right. Yeah.
Matt, real quick with your question, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to keep that quick. Most worshipful, great presentation. Good to see you.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you, your books are very profound, especially In Search of Light it's an incredible book. So I highly recommend that for any Mason who's really looking for a deeper insight into the allegories of our degrees. But my question for you is, with the decline in membership in Masonry, I'd like to hear your views on that. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We often hear that we are experiencing a Masonic renaissance. We're getting back to the basics of what we should be doing. And I think, In Search of Light and all of the podcasts and publications and blogs, everything that we're seeing happening now really resonates with that. So I'd just like to hear your take on that.
Well, it's a bad thing from the point of view that we're declining. We've been in a state of decline every year since 1959, and that curve doesn't get flattened out. It's a constant downward trend. And if you follow the statistics from that trend, what that's going to tell you is that we're going to have very few Masons in 20 years. And the problem with that is the Masons that we will have left in 20 years are either going to have to create new lodges that enables them to have the lodge experience that meets their expectations, or they're going to have to be in lodges in metropolitan areas or in regional economic centers that still have lodge buildings intact and still have membership. The problem with the decline is that most of the lodges in every state are rural lodges, and many of those lodges are made up of 50 members or less. And those 50 members are largely made up of men that are over 70 years of age. Those lodges are going to die. And unless you could get a spark plug into those lodges and he could change the culture of that existing lodge, unfortunately, those lodges aren't going to be around. So we've got to replace. I like the idea of a leaner, smaller Masonry, sure do. But I don't know how to create that unless we make it easier for new lodges to get chartered. And I think those lodges should follow the European model and be based on affinity groups.
Brother Matt, that was a great question, and one that we could certainly discuss all of the rest of this year and into next year. So great question. Worship Brother Bizak, I believe you had a question for Most Worshipful as well.
I do. Excellent overview, Most Worshipful. Your
It's
book's
great
one
to
of
see
the
you,
most
John.
used in my library. What do you, this is a question sort of like Dan's, what do you consider the most significant event or occurrence in the evolution of the American ritual?
Well, unfortunately, the most significant event that occurred at the beginning of the Depression, and it lasted through the World War II era, man. And what was significant about that is if you look at what Freemasons were doing in every generation of men prior to the Depression of the 1930s, in literally every generation of men, they were focused on adapting and tweaking things in order to stay centered around the popular culture of men. And that's a speech in and of itself. And I can give you examples in every generation. For 300 years, Freemasons paid attention to what interested men, and they tried to adapt themselves so that they would always be centered around what men were interested in. And that existed in every generation up until the Depression. And what happened in the Depression is that's when the three males in every household went away. You know, before that, you could pretty well depend on 3 generations of males in every household. And if your grandfather was a Mason and your father was a Mason, you were a Mason. That's why we never had to solicit anybody for membership. It was just a natural evolution. And because of the high rate of rural outmigration that occurred during the Depression, we created the first generation gap this fraternity has ever known. Even then, Grand Lodges made adaptations to be important to the Depression era. They made adaptations to be important to the World War II era. And when they brought in all of these men after the World War II era, they made a terrible strategic error. And that is they forgot to require men to look back over their shoulder and see what Freemasonry did in past generations. And so we created all of a sudden a generation of men who only knew the ritual, because that's the only thing they ever saw about Freemasonry. And most of them chose not to be active. And so the most significant thing that happened to us is we developed this rut. And for the first time in the history of our fraternity, we stayed in this rut, you know, from the 50s all the way through today. And until we get back and understand how we adapt ourselves to become a part of the popular culture in every new generation, we will not overcome our challenges. So you weren't expecting a bad answer is the most significant thing, but I'm telling you, that's the most significant thing that happened in American Freemasonry.
That's a very interesting and insightful answer. Thank you very much. And thank you again for accepting our invitation to speak tonight.
Thank you. I'd like to offer the floor to one other person who has been mentioned a few times this evening. Right Worshipful Brother Jackson, we'd love to hear from you this evening. Make sure you're doing okay. I know you're dealing with some medical issues, and we just want you to know that you are in our thoughts and prayers as well. So the floor is yours with anything you'd like to add.
Thank you, Brian. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be back and listen to a Rubicon presentation. Unfortunately, I was not able to make the last couple of meetings that you had, but they left me out of the hospital Friday so I can have the opportunity to listen to Bob once again. Bob, we've been friends for a long while. You've always been on my short list as one of the intellectual Freemasons in North America. Note, I did not say intellectuals that were Freemasons. I said intellectual Freemasons. Great presentation tonight. You gave a condensation of the history, evolution of the history of Freemasonry, along with the development of the ritual. And you're right, I have seen a lot of rituals in my travels. And I look at rituals today as being a separate pathway to the same end. I don't think what ritual is being used is as significant as what the result is at the end of that ritual. And there are Grand Lodges in much of the world today that will utilize many rituals. All of them are approved by the Grand Lodge, and very few in North America. Louisiana, of course, has multiple rituals, but most of the North American Grand Lodges utilize one ritual. And frankly, I think I'm correct in this, Bob. does not most of them use the web ritual or some version of the web ritual?
Yes. I mean, Pennsylvania is one of the few Grand Lodges that do not, as you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh,
Almost all of them are Preston Webb.
Well, it's certainly been my privilege and pleasure to be with the Rubicon Society again tonight, and Bob, especially to hear your presentation. You never failed me.
Well,
Thank you.
Tom, let me tell you, brother, you made my day. Tom is, I just can't tell you what Tom has done for me through the years, and I just love you, man. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, sure hope you get better.
Well, the feeling's mutual. Thank you.
Great. Most worshipful, thank you very much for your time this evening. We will proceed to close out. And any final comments you would like to add before we do that?
No, Brian, just thank you for honoring me by being present this evening. And I hope my talk met with your expectations. And I certainly enjoyed John, Bizek, Gerald, yourself, Tom. I mean, I've only been able to see 6 or 8 guys that are here, and it's just such a pleasure to see men I've known and for a while. Yeah.
Well, we thank you
so much.
We thank you very much. Brothers and friends, we are meeting next month, September 27th, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we will be having discussion and a presentation by our very own Worshipful Brother Bizak and Worshipful Brother Kimball, discussing some of the stories. And Brother Dan, I just realized I spelt your name wrong there, so my apologies on the card. Discussing their newest and one of the most recent books, A Candle in the Dark. Inside this book, you'll find stories that tell discussions being held about Masonic groups across the United States at this time. This discussion within this book addresses the essence of Freemasonry from the Age of Enlightenment into the modern era. It's a very unique read, a very unique publication, and look forward to hearing more about that next meeting. The instructions for joining that meeting will be sent out to everyone Monday morning of the meeting date, and anyone who is not on that meeting can RSVP as well. Brother Kimball, Brother Nitsky, any final comments from William Ware?
Thank you, Brother Evans. Thank you for the opportunity to talk just for a brief moment. I'll just keep my comments short. Worship Brother Davis, I'm kind of lost of words. This presentation hit home in several different areas in where we are heading in our past. And I think the brothers tonight can take a lot from this and get into some education and to some research. So what you did tonight, great job. So thank you, and I'll give my comments to that.
Thank you, Worship Brother. And on behalf of Lexington Lodge No. 1 and Rubicon Masonic Society, again, we thank you. Excellent presentation. Your knowledge is incredible. Your memory is incredible, and we appreciate all the research you've done so that way we can learn from your knowledge. Worship Brother Tom, would you please do the honors of closing us out this evening?
Sure will. Brothers, if you will. Supreme Architect of the universe, accept our humble praises for the many mercies and blessings which thy bounty has conferred on us, and especially for this friendly and social intercourse. Pardon, we beseech thee, whatever thou hast seen amiss in us since we have been together, and continue to us thy presence, protection, and blessing. Make us sensible of the renewed obligations we are under to love thee supremely and to be friendly to each other. May all our irregular passions be subdued, and may we daily increase in faith, hope, and charity, but more especially in that charity, which is the bond of peace and the perfection of every virtue. May we so practice thy precepts that we finally obtain thy promises and find every entrance through the gates into the temple and city of our God. Amen.
So mote it be.
So mote it be.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. If you know of anyone else that might be interested, they can RSVP at RubiconMasonicSociety.com/RSVP. Please keep all sick and distress in your prayers. Always trust in God with all your heart and your commitment to Freemasonry.